I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Critical minerals, a phrase that we hear nearly every day, yet one that is too often used with little explanation. What exactly are critical minerals? Where are they found? And why are they so critical? We're joined today by someone who is uniquely well equipped to help us answer these and many other questions. Journalist Ernest Scheyder is the author of the award-winning book, The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. The book was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the 2024 Financial Times and Schroders Business Book of the Year. The Financial Times called it, quote, a nuanced and invaluable deep dive into the questions that need to be addressed if we are to fight climate change and achieve energy security, end quote. We are pleased to welcome Ernest Scheyder to Earlylands in Conversation. And of course, if you enjoy this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. Ernest, thank you very much for joining us today. Where are we finding you? I think you're in your home office, right?
Hey, Todd, it's good to be with you. I'm based in Houston, and so I'm coming to you from the Texas energy capital.
Well, thank you for joining today. I have finished fairly recently, and you and I have been going back and forth over trying to find a time that works for us, and you've been hugely cooperative with schedules. I finished last year the book, The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And I immediately thought I have to have Ernest on the show. It's won every award, it seems. It was on all the best of lists in 2024. So I count myself very fortunate to have you. But let's start with kind of your career journey. I think everybody always likes to hear about the path that our guests have taken. So you've covered two of the defining energy transitions of our time: the U.S. shale revolution, certainly there out of Houston, and now the green energy transition and the minerals that underpin that. Can you walk us through your career path and how your years covering fracking and the shale boom in the U.S. shaped your approach to the reporting on critical minerals?
Sure. Well, like I said, great to be with you and here on the podcast today. So I've been a journalist for, more than 20 years. And I started my career in New York City after school, where I was first at the Associated Press, and then I joined Reuters, where I was covering general energy topics. And
As
this
they say,
was
everybody's got to do a couple years in New York, right?
Yes, indeed. The U.S. shale boom had not really taken off yet at that point. There had
Right.
been some initial rumblings of how different types of technology could change how we produce oil and natural gas in this country, mostly via fracking. But if you'll recall back then, the term fracking was not in the popular vernacular,
That's
and
right.
rather it was used by TV shows to get around censors. So if you wanted to say fracking on
Right.
TV, it was not referring to oil or gas extraction. It was a way to
That's
get
right.
around censorship. And so the technology slowly became more and more popular, and it was revolutionizing how the US was producing oil and natural gas. So I did a lot of stories in Pennsylvania and Ohio, where there is a lot of shale formations, and that
Right.
definitely, lent itself to some fascinating opportunities. But then in 2014, my my day job as a journalist, they said, "Why don't you move to North Dakota?" And I was a little taken aback at first by that, but it was a fascinating opportunity, and I did it. I moved to Williston, North Dakota, where I was writing about how shale was basically making North Dakota one of the fastest growing economies in the world, warts and all. My rent in
Right.
North Dakota was more than double what I was paying in New York City. And I think that
That's
just
crazy.
underscores it's
Wow.
wild, right? I mean, it just underscores the supply demand imbalance that was happening at that time. I mean, buildings were sprouting up overnight. Police were having to deal with a whole influx of crime. I mean, 20-year-olds on fracking rigs could be making $100,000 right out of high school. Like it was a lot of
Wild
loss.
West, literally and
It was very
figuratively,
much,
right?
very much the Wild West, but as a journalist, I was fascinated by the space and had a great opportunity there. And then decided to move to Houston to write about big oil and OPEC and how shale was revolutionizing basically the global oil market. OPEC at the time was pretty much afraid of U.S. shale, was afraid of this fracking renaissance. And so it was a good
Right.
opportunity to write about how different OPEC ministers were responding to that. But I became very curious through all of this oil coverage about the energy transition. At the time, Teslas were becoming increasingly more popular. People started talking about climate change. We had the Paris Climate Accords out there. There was a lot of folks saying we need to use less oil and gas in our lives and use more renewable energy. That, of course, means different things, I think, to different people.
Right.
But at its core, it was obvious to me then, as it is even still today, that we're going to need a lot more critical minerals if we're going to go green. And so I jumped in as a journalist in my day job to write about the companies that want to produce lithium and copper, cobalt and nickel and rare earths and many other critical minerals. I immediately saw parallels with my time covering oil and gas. I mean, certainly
Oh,
there's a lot of environmental concerns, there's local landowner concerns, there's regulatory concerns, and certainly they're all sort of under the broad umbrella of energy production. But there's a lot of differences as well. And, it was story after story in my day job. I started writing more about these tensions there around specific projects, including in the United States. The United States has not been a big producer of many of these critical minerals
right.
historically the past few decades. So there has been attempts to mine more lithium here or mine more nickel or other critical minerals. And several projects kept getting huge pushback from either environmental groups or conservation groups or indigenous groups or regulatory bodies. And if the goal is to help address climate change, and we are seeing a lot of more electronic devices be used every day in our lives, the question I had was, okay, well, where are we going to get these building blocks?
Sure.
Because
Of
right now, the
course.
US, at least at the time, the US is producing hardly any of these. And so that led me to the war below. I mean, that was the kernel of an idea to basically explore that question. And the question that I really wanted to bring with the book was, what are the choices that we're willing to make if we want this energy transition, if we want to fight climate change, if we want this electrified future? And that was as I say, the animating question here. And so that really drove me for the better part of 3 or 4 years as I dove into the reporting for the book and then for the writing. And I focused mostly on US projects, although I
Right.
do go internationally. But I wanted the US audience especially to have to grapple with these tough ideas of choice, which I think are so crucial now. And the book and the topics in it have only gotten more and more pertinent since first was published, because now as we sit here today in 2026, we see that critical mineral production and processing are being used not just to address climate change, but as instruments of power, really, in geopolitics and global
Of course.
trade and other areas. They're in the headlines every other day, it seems. And so I think the question at the core of The War Below is extremely pertinent because again, it really encourages the reader to be thinking through this idea of where do we want to get these building blocks? And if we don't mine them in our backyard, are we comfortable with their extraction in places that might not share the same
Sure.
social and safety standards that we expect in the United States?
Yeah.
And if we don't have the discussion about it, are we comfortable people using them as economic weapons? Because that's what's happening right now.
Well, you open the book with a really striking paradox. You have this rare flower.
Teams buckwheat, as in I'm on a
Teams.
football team.
Right,
Yes.
right, right. TIEHM, but Teams buckwheat that exists
Yes.
nowhere else on Earth, but it's growing on top of one of America's most valuable lithium deposits at Rhyolite Ridge in Nevada. Walk us through
Yes.
that story just quickly, but because I think it's great because it captures the paradox that you just described.
It, to me, really, really got at the core of this tension, and which is why I made Teams Buckwheat the narrative spine for The War Below. So, roughly 200 miles north of Las Vegas is one of the largest lithium deposits in North America. And the genesis of how that lithium became the target of a mining company was when this company was exploring for gold, actually, and discovered all this lithium there. Now, unfortunately for that company, that site is the home to a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet, as you say, known as Teams buckwheat. It was discovered in the 1980s by a botanist working for the New York Botanical Garden. And the question right from the beginning is, okay, if we need lithium for the energy transition, is the lithium at that site more important than this flower? And
Right,
the flower's cause gets taken up by a conservationist who says, look, I have nothing against lithium mining, but we can't prioritize fighting climate change over the biodiversity crisis that's engulfing our planet. As different species go extinct and we lose some of that special biodiversity we have out there, we lose something as humans, as citizens of this
right,
world. And so he takes up the cause of this flower. Meanwhile, the company that would like to mine the lithium the chairman of the board is a former oil executive who really sees his mission as a human being to help leave a cleaner planet than the one that he found. Now, he, as I said, he grew up in the oil and gas industry, spent the early part of his career there, made a lot of money. But for him, building this lithium mine is almost a kind of penance
Um,
in a way. He really sees it as his mission to help clean up energy production globally. And
right.
so to me, the tension between those 2 points of views really gets at this tension that is really only mushrooming further as we have more critical minerals
Right.
demand globally.
Right. I mean, it's so many of these issues and just what you just described there, that dynamic it's so zero sum, right? I mean, it's in many respects that if you want to develop this resource, we're going to have to destroy the biodiversity. And but the resource will play a huge role in a clean energy transition. So it's pretty stark. And but you do a wonderful job of covering that tension, those paradoxes. In the book, as you mentioned earlier, you focus on five critical minerals: lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths, which aren't that rare, right? And we've talked about that before on the podcast. But copper seems to be emerging as sort of this critical bottleneck, with Bloomberg projecting a 19 million ton shortfall by 2050. USGS, the Geological Survey, has only added it to the critical minerals list fairly recently, just last year, I think. And so, why do you think copper flew under the radar for so long? And does its recent elevation sort of change the strategic calculus?
Copper is the cornerstone metal for the energy transition, for our fight against climate change, for the AI that's going on now. Copper is in pretty much every single electronic device. It's great at conducting electricity. It's highly
Right,
malleable. It's found in most places in the planet. So it's not centered in one geographic location. There are multiple ways to produce it. So not one party can sort of corner
right,
its production. But we need a lot of it, and we're not producing a lot of it right now in the United States. For instance, the U.S. basically imports half of its copper each year. Well, it
right,
has a lot of copper mines, but it only has two copper smelters. So just because you take the rock out of the ground doesn't mean you can turn it into the form that can be used to make wiring or pipe
right.
or
I
other
mean,
related.
processing is such a big part of the story that doesn't
Correct.
really get the attention it should, right?
Correct. And I think because of that the huge importance, it will only cause more friction in the future around sourcing. You mentioned that BNEF study, but S&P Global earlier this month put out a study saying that by 2040, copper supplies are expected to fall short by more than 10 million metric tons annually without more mining and more recycling. So
Wow.
I think that number further lays bare the need for copper out there, and where are we going to get it? I think that report focusing on recycling partially is key here because, the United States exports hundreds of millions of pounds worth of electronic scrap every year that contains a lot of copper. Why it does that is beyond me. We need to be doing more recycling. Recycling for critical minerals is a great way to ensure circularity of supply, including and
Right,
especially with copper. Just because copper has been sitting in a cell phone for 30 years does not mean that it can't be recycled and put into a new cell phone or
right,
another electronic device. Same with lithium or other critical minerals. Unlike with oil or gas, when you combust it in an engine to create electricity that is gone forever and it contributes to climate change, that's not the case with critical minerals. So
indeed.
I think
Ex-
copper, especially here, is a key component and will be for the future. It's used widely across construction, transportation, and as we mentioned, electronics and AI. And I don't think it's necessarily flown under the radar so much as been one of those sort of workhorse critical minerals that's been taken for granted. The United States government didn't even consider copper critical until last year, as you were
Right,
saying, Todd. And the European Union, though, has considered it pretty critical for much, much, much longer. And, different people have different definitions as to what constitutes a critical mineral. But for me, a mineral is critical when you realize that you need a lot of it and you don't produce a lot of it. So
right,
you're reliant
exactly.
on other people for it. And I think the United States is increasingly realizing that if it wants to have a lot more AI, if it wants to use a lot more high tech weaponry in the US military, if it wants more cell phones and laptops for its population, that it's going to need to have a lot more critical minerals, including and especially copper. And, the subtitle of my book, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, does obviously highlight two critical minerals. But we went back and forth on the subtitle, me and the publisher. At
Right.
first, we wanted to have a general turn, but we really thought that lithium and copper were the two critical minerals that perhaps had broken through the popular zeitgeist and would be known by the average person. And so, given A, their importance for these topics, and B, sort of that potential breakthrough there, we used them. And if I wrote the headline again today, I probably would do the same because they're extremely, extremely important for these conversations.
I'm going to ask you a question here that's pretty loaded, and I could have just opened with this and we could have talked for 45 minutes. But you spent years reporting on mining projects across the US, fracking, et cetera, and around the world. What surprised you most when you closed your laptop with the with the manuscript done and someone said, what was your biggest takeaway? What was your biggest surprise in your reporting? Was it something like that fact that you just said, that we have so little processing capacity in the United States and really in the West overall? Most of it sits in China. But yeah, what surprised you the most?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a surprise so much as it just sort of reinforced the realization for me that the average person, especially in the West, doesn't understand mining at all.
Sure,
And that
exactly. I
is
think that's so
really
true.
intriguing to me. Everything we touch, most things we touch every single day come out of a farm or out of a mine. And I think we understand that implicitly when it comes to our food coming out of a farm. And I think partly that's because people in schools, at least in the United States, are taught about the process to grow food, right? Photosynthesis, the nitrogen cycle, et cetera. You remember back to elementary school, Todd, you probably had a teacher, as I did, that, would brought a seed in, brought some dirt in and said, all right,
Sure,
we're
of
going to
course.
plant this seed. And over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see it grow. And we're going to talk about how
There's
the
going to be a
light coming in
potato
through the
there in a
window.
few weeks. And yeah,
Correct. Yeah, we're gonna, sprinkle it with water every few days, and that clearly was a learning aid, a teaching aid to help people understand the agriculture industry. We don't really have a parallel for the mining industry, even though it's extremely important for our lives. I mean, the microphones that we're talking to each other through right now, Todd, are connected by copper wiring and a lot of other
right,
critical
right.
minerals. And I think sometimes there's a recoil when you bring up that point and say maybe we should teach more second or third graders about mining, that it's seen as sort of like, oh, you're basically reciting the industry's talking points. And I think there's a way to do it without necessarily saying, we have to mine everywhere, because I think there are core questions around, are there places too special to mine? But I think having that education, having that knowledge base lets people have those conversations and have those talking points, and teaching second or third graders that mining provides the building blocks for their lives, I think is an important learning point. And so when
Absolutely.
we get to these really, really sticky questions around, should we be mining in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota? Should we be mining on indigenous holy grounds in Arizona? Should we let this flower go extinct in Nevada so we can get lithium for the energy transition? I mean, there's no clear cut answers to a lot of this stuff, but it requires, I think, an informed populace having an understanding about mining. And that was my goal with The War Below. I mean, this is not a book for investors
Right,
or
right.
regulators or people in the mining industry or conservationists. I mean, this is a book for everyone in the West and pretty much everyone in the world, because these are topics that affect all of us. So the more that we have these debates, the better.
That you're heading on a later question, but I'll jump to it because it's something I'm pretty passionate about. And my firm, we do a lot of work in the mining sector. Spend a lot of time in Malawi, Zambia, et cetera. And when we talk to operators, one of the biggest constraints, operational constraints they mention, are the lack of talent, the lack of young people wanting to go into mining, because young people don't find it a sexy industry. They don't understand it. They don't understand the criticality of it. I mean, I talked to my 19-year-old son, who is quite a tech guy and, just fascinated with how things work. And I'm constantly telling him to think about opportunities in mining. And there's a fascinating anecdote in your reporting about Freeport McMoran, largest copper producer in the US, experiencing production declines, not because of weather or equipment, but because they can't hire enough miners. So, to help us understand how serious the workforce constraint is on domestic mining ambitions, because I certainly see it, in Africa, for example, and how are people working to solve it, right? How are they trying to encourage 18 and 19-year-olds to think not just about, a job at Meta or an AI or whatever, but going to work for the likes of Anglo American or Rio Tinto?
I mean, it's definitely a huge problem for the industry, and especially in the United States. I think in the United States, when the average person thinks about mining, because of that sort of lack of knowledge that we were just discussing, they think about the coal industry. Now, for better or worse, the coal
Right, right.
industry has been around in the United States for a very long time, and it has a lot of negative implications tied to it. I mean, I don't know if you remember that movie with Jake Gyllenhaal, October Sky, that came out about
Right.
20 or 30 years ago.
Right.
Famously,
Yes.
he doesn't want to go into the coal mines. His dad is a coal miner, and Jake Gyllenhaal's character rejects it because he wants to go into space. And so he ends up working for NASA. It's a true
Right.
story. And I
Right.
think that, obviously that is about one particular person's journey, but it said something about coal mining. And so I think the average person, when they think about mining in general, they think they're going to be stuck underground for 40 years developing
Black
some
lung
kind of lung
disease. And
disease.
yeah.
Yes. And that is not the case if you're going to mine for copper or lithium or nickel. I mean, not all mines are underground.
Right.
Mining has a lot of high tech components to it. If you want to test autonomous vehicles, the best place to do it is a mine because you don't have pedestrians and you have huge, huge, huge trucks that and basically go back and forth. And then you can program them. So it really actually is a cool spot to test AI, to test autonomy. And I don't think the average person realizes that right now. And so it
Right.
is a big challenge. It's also, obviously a very physically challenging job. It can be, but the use of more technology does abate that somewhat. I did a deep dive into this area before I even wrote this book, and I interviewed a bunch of engineering students at schools that were accredited for mining engineering all across the
Right.
country. And many of them chose not to focus on mining engineering, but on things like civil engineering or petroleum engineering, ironically, all because they thought if they studied mining engineering, they'd end up working at a coal mine. But what they don't realize is companies like Freeport, companies like BHP, Rio Tinto, and others pay very well for mining
Oh,
companies. And a lot of mining schools, like the Colorado School of Mines, University of Arizona, many others, are really eager for mining engineering students. And so
it's
I tell every young person, if you have any interest in engineering, reach out to one of these schools and talk to them because they'd be very, very eager to have you as students in there. Obviously, there's a lot of math that goes with it and a lot of other stuff like that. But if you're inclined to an engineering or math career, I encourage people to explore it.
well, I'm certainly going to make my son listen to this, right? And I think I've done a good job of brainwashing him about the opportunities in the sector. But that's great. Well, let's shift a little bit. I don't think we could talk about critical minerals. We can't talk about lithium, copper, et cetera, without talking about their role today in geopolitics. President Trump has struck a flurry of bilateral minerals agreements alongside equity investments in domestic companies like MP Materials, Trilogy Metals. This is a fundamentally different approach to mineral security than what we saw, certainly under the Biden administration and administrations before that. How do you assess this style of mineral diplomacy, or what does even mineral diplomacy mean to you? And do you think it could actually move the needle against China's dominance? All of the processing essentially occurs for these minerals in China. So that's a big question, another big one, but tackle that if you can.
So, yes, critical minerals are at the center of global geopolitics right now, global diplomacy, in a way that they perhaps have never been before. But it's not like it just came out of nowhere, right? I mean, these issues have been slowly growing the past 15 or 20 years. It was on the mind of President Obama when he was in office, President Trump the first time, President Biden, and now President Trump the second time. I think what has crystallized attention in the past 12 months on these issues is that we need a lot more of these critical minerals now, or at least we're realizing we do in a way that we hadn't before, due in part to the AI boom that's coming out there. All these AI data centers need a lot of copper, and many of them want to have battery storage, large batteries on site that requires a lot of lithium, basically stationary batteries. At the same time, we have a lot of trade conflicts going on globally as the United States imposes tariffs on some products. And that in turn has led China and others that are large producers or processors of critical minerals to
Right.
use that output as leverage in trade disputes. So China has in the past used its control of these areas as diplomatic tools. Most famously in 2010, it blocked exports of rare earths to Japan after a diplomatic spat over a fishing vessel. That didn't last all that long, but it definitely sent alarm bells through the government in Tokyo. It wasn't
Right.
perhaps heeded by the entire government in Washington. And so now what we have here today is an attempt to, I would say, move fast, move very, very fast in the administration. And so you see President Trump, as you're saying, take equity stakes in several companies, two of which I profile in the war below. The US government is now the largest shareholder in MP Materials, which is the largest rare earths mine in the United States. They're also working on a magnet facility in Texas that will basically take those rare earths and turn them into magnets that can be used in electric vehicles, in weapons, and cell phones, etc. You might not realize, Todd, but the average person has a rare earth magnet in their pocket. It's the thing that makes your cell phone vibrate. And
Right.
so they are extremely popular, extremely important for our global economy. The US government also took a stake in Lithium Americas, which is building the largest lithium mine in North America in northern Nevada. And that deal was announced last fall. And this is also a company that I profile in the War Below and take the reader to the site. So huge attention on these very, very large, important projects from these companies. Now, the administration has said that it wants to take these equity stakes partly to give the taxpayer, a potential investment opportunity here,
Sure.
almost as if
Right.
you were like a stockbroker or something saying, hey, we should invest here. It is a full throated, novel approach that hasn't really been taken by previous administrations unless there were times of large economic distress. Like, for instance, in 2008, 2009, the US government became the largest shareholder in General Motors. The
Right. Of course.
decision was derided at the time. If you remember, Todd, I mean, a lot of people pejoratively said, oh, it's government motors. And, GM worked as hard as it could to basically pay off any indebtment to Washington as fast as it could and basically buy back those shares. But there is no such pejorative for these critical minerals companies. And I think the critical minerals industry, especially in the United States, realizes that it needs Washington now, perhaps more than ever. And you are seeing that reflected in equity investments that Washington is making, not just in MP and Lithium Americas, but in Trilogy, as you mentioned. It's buying warrants in other companies that are out there. And we will see where this goes. But it is part of an attempt to directly invest in these industries. Now, if you
Right.
are getting an equity investment from the US government, that of course has a lot of sort of implicit guarantees or at least says something about your business. And so that sends
Of
a signal
course.
to the market as well.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I mean, this idea of choosing national champions, so to speak, certainly has its advocates and also its critics. But we have a lot of listeners who are focused on Africa, and you do touch it on it throughout the book too. How do you think about Africa's position in this global scramble? The DRC comes up all the time because of its amazing resources of copper, lithium, cobalt, coltan, you name it. Same with Zambia and elsewhere. How should we think about Africa's position in this global scramble?
Yeah, I had the great opportunity when I was reporting out the War Below to talk with Richard Adkerson, who was the chairman and CEO, it still is the chairman of Freeport McMoran, which, due to some unfortunate and ill-timed investments in the oil industry, found
Right,
itself with a
right.
large debt pile that it needed to quickly cull. And so it was forced about 5 or 6 years ago to sell the largest cobalt mine in the world and some other projects in the DRC. They ended up selling it to a Chinese company. It was essentially a fire sale. And obviously, the company did not want to do that and looks wistfully at that asset today. But, it's been pumping out cobalt left and right. And obviously, there's a lot of moves by the government and the DRC to limit exports. There have been some recent steps around that. But I think broadly, to answer your question, Africa is extremely important for the critical mineral supply chains globally and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. And as we're talking right now, the Future Minerals Forum is going on in Saudi Arabia, and there's a lot of discussions around investments into DRC and elsewhere. The US governments, European Union governments, and others are looking at supplies there. So I think they will continue to be extremely important for the foreseeable future. There are questions, of course, as they are for other deposits around the world, on where will you process them, how will you get them to market. So I think things like the Libido corridor, the rail network there are going to be important. But I think broadly, we're going to see a lot more investment into Africa mining, even more so than we have as
Sure.
projects move forward.
I visited the Tenke mine in the DRC. I think it was in 2014, right? Just before the Freeport sale. Gosh, I think if a lot of people could go back then, that would have unfolded differently in terms of how that divestment occurred. Let's talk a little bit about this sort of industry consolidation. When you were writing The War Below, BHP's attempted takeover of Anglo American was unfolding. We saw last year, of course, the Anglo American Tech merger. We're now seeing, of course, discussions of a potential merger between Rio Tinto and Glencore. What do you make of this scramble, so to speak, to consolidate, particularly around copper? And does it reshape any of your conclusions that you reached in the book?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Todd. This is all about copper. So all of these companies realize copper is huge importance, and they're angling for it left and right. And because of the conflicts globally around building new copper mines, many companies realize that their best way to increase their copper production is through M&A rather than organic or new
Right.
mines. And so that's why you're starting to see companies really, really look. If you got a lot of copper, or you want a lot of copper, you are keeping an eye out for potential deals. And so that's why, as you say, Anglo and Teck are combining. Glencore and Rio are in conversations right now. We'll learn in the weeks ahead what happens there. But it all comes back to copper. And I don't think it would have changed how I wrote the book, because I think what I wanted to do is, regardless of where the headlines changed, I wanted to present some themes in the book that would stick with the reader and be evergreen regardless of
Right.
what might
Of
happen
course.
with news. And so yeah, by underscoring the importance of copper projects and the tension around building new ones, I think what I was really trying to make the reader do is sort of think through the sourcing or the supply chains, which can be a bit of a wonky, maybe sleepy topic, but are extremely important. So I hope that if someone picks The War Below up 10 years from now, will still find it informative and relevant, because I'm honing in on these themes, not necessarily what's in the headlines at the time.
Right. The latest M&A rumor that will pass, but I think you very much talk about the underlying structural dynamics to this industry.
Sure. I mean,
So
companies are always trying to buy each other. That's just the
right.
nature of corporate America, and that's just the nature of publicly traded companies. But to me, it's at these broader core issues, if you'll forgive the mining pun, that I think is extremely important for the reader to consider.
Well, we keep talking about China throughout this, almost every question that's come up. And you note in the book that China has realized that, quote, whoever controls the production of lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, and other critical minerals will control the 21st century economy. At the same time, you also point out that many American and Western companies are deeply embedded in Chinese supply chains. How do you think policymakers and investors should think about this? What is true interdependence, right? Move beyond the headlines and the political sound bites and tell us how you think about this weaponization of critical minerals and of processing, et cetera. Give us a little bit more of a proper intellectual framework to think about China's position.
Well, China has very shrewdly realized, it did shrewdly realize, as you said in your question, Todd, that whoever controls the production and processing of critical minerals will control the 21st century economy, the way that control of oil defined the 20th century economy. And China realized this even back in the 20th century. And so it moved rather shrewdly to invest in processing facilities, invest in mines throughout the world,
Right,
including, as we were just discussing, in the DRC. And it also, more importantly, built a manufacturing base that encouraged manufacturers to locate into mainland China, and said, hey, like, if you locate here, you can have access VAT free to a lot of these critical minerals that are processed within our borders. And so that's been a huge boon. So the reason why Albemarle, the world's largest lithium company, which is
right,
also based in the United States, has most of its processing facilities in mainland China, is because there's a lot of cathode demand in China and East Asia broadly. Now, cathode is one part of a battery. You've got cathode and an anode. Cathodes are usually built with a lot of lithium. So if you've got an end customer there making cathode in mainland China or East Asia, it behooves you to refine that lithium there. And so as the United States and other Western countries work to build up their critical mineral supply chains, I mean, obviously you're going to need to have a lot more manufacturing. And so there has been some attempts by the Inflation Reduction Act, by the Big Beautiful Bill that President Trump signed, and others to try to encourage more of that downstream component or that manufacturing here, but it's not nearly as large as in other parts of the world. And so that's a tension, which is why I think you see in the rare earth space, for instance, you see a lot of rare earths mining companies get interested in magnet production. Because obviously, just because you take rare earths out of the ground doesn't necessarily mean you can put them into your Tesla. You obviously have to make magnets with them. And so that manufacturing component has been a big focus for the rare earth space. We do need to build more cathode facilities in the United States. There's no way around that. That's a reality. So if you're a lithium mine, you hope that there is more cathode production here. But that's part of the reason why China has been such a dominant force in the space.
tell us what, when you were sitting down doing your priorities list, as we all do, and of course, rhetorical priorities list for 2026, what are the stories in this space and on your beat that you're really paying attention to? Is it China? Is it strategic investments by the US government in certain companies? Is it M&A, Rio Tinto, Glencore? What are you watching this year?
I think, Todd, you just took part of my list. So
All right, I should be a journalist too.
all of those things. Look, I mean, critical minerals will continue to dominate headlines in 2026. They will continue to be at the center of global trade discussions. And so I think that will be a key area for everyone to keep front of mind. I think different technologies and how we process critical minerals are going to be really intriguing to look out for. I think certainly we are going to see different efforts to break free of China's market control in the critical mineral space, and how that actually plays out. I think we'll see some interesting movements, I would expect, from various regulators, policymakers, companies, and others. And I think the more and more we get an electrified global economy with AI, with automation, with other high tech components, I think it's only going to further reinforce that we need more critical minerals. I mean, we sort of laugh at it now, but robotics is a huge growth area, and I don't think we fully grasp how much robots are going to change critical minerals demand and also perhaps change our lives. I mean, it's cliche to think about Rosie from the Jetsons cartoon,
Right,
but I don't know if we're all going to have a robot folding our laundry. But there could be a lot more robots doing other basic tasks, and that will require a lot more critical minerals.
right. There's a
Certainly,
lot of copper in
manufacturing right
Rosie's.
now is a lot. Yeah, exactly. A lot of copper and Rosie, and different industries are already using a lot more robotics now than 40 years ago. Manufacturing, for instance, I mean, a lot of
Right.
Teslas are built with robots.
It's going to be an exciting year ahead for you. I look forward to catching your reporting. Well, I can't believe it. Already hit the usual stop mark here, and I haven't been able to ask you always maybe my favorite question, but I always close all of our interviews with asking every guest to give us a couple books to add to our nightstand to help us understand what we're talking about. Something to take us beyond, say, for example, the war below. What else should our listeners be reading?
So I definitely recommend Volt Rush, which is a great book. It's
Volt
by Henry
Rush.
Sanderson. Volt Rush, yeah, by Henry Sanderson. Great book. I also recommend Cobalt Red by Siddharth Kara. That
Right,
came out a
right,
few years ago. Cobalt Red can be a bit sobering. It's about the cobalt supply chain in the DRC and the sometimes unfortunately low ESG standards that are used to produce it. But it's an important read. Volt Rush looks a lot of global projects in the critical minerals space. And then definitely, I always recommend it's about oil, but The Prize by Dan Yergin.
a
Great
wonderful
book to
book.
just get wonderful book to get a broad overview just of energy in general. And I think it served for me as a nice underpinning here for the war below conceptually. And I think, if you're thinking about energy infrastructure at all, The Prize is a great place to start.
The only thing I would recommend is if you're traveling, get it on Kindle because it usually weighs about
It is
two
a big book,
pounds.
yes. Yes, yes. Not necessarily a book to take between planes, but, one for the digital reading experience, certainly.
Absolutely. I can't thank you enough, Ernest, for coming on and chatting. The book is The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. It's a truly wonderful read. It will definitely stand the test of time. Ernest Scheyder, thank you so much for joining us, my friend.
It's great to be with you, Todd.